My name is Richard Laing. I'm presenting this morning actually on behalf of both myself and one of my colleagues, Marianthe Leon. We're both from Robert Gordon University, which is up in Aberdeen, where my main area of research normally deals with built environment visualization, and Marianthe's area of expertise is particularly to do with collaboration, and where we're trying to foster collaboration among design teams, but also among design teams and members of the public. So before I get on to the talk, I'll maybe explain. The talk itself is very much about how we were trying to use ICT to help design teams collaborate at the very earliest stages of design. But the nucleus, or the origin of the research rather, had a nucleus that wasn't actually to do with design teams. It came out of much earlier research that we did, which was looking at trying to encourage design teams not so much to collaborate with each other, but to work with the end user of their design. So we'd done a number of studies that had been kind of European research, which had dealt with things like public space, where we'd spent, that subject of trying to encourage design teams and planners to collaborate with end users of design was a kind of major research topic in the 1990s and up to the present day to some extent, but within environmental psychology and anthropology as well as design. So during that process, we developed a whole load of ways that we could try to do things like track the way that people use computers, to try to understand what are people looking at when they see certain images on a screen and so on. So we actually embarked on the first part of this research where that was going to be our focus. It was going to be on how do designers collaborate with the end user. But this was about four and a half years ago. And about a year before that, we decided, okay, we're going to continue with our normal research process. But almost immediately, we found ourselves attending events that were being run by the BIM task group. We attended an event at Northumbria University, which was one of the early academic forum conferences looking at BIM and collaboration. And we kind of felt, well, maybe actually the challenge here is not so much how do the design team communicate their ideas to the end user, but actually how does the design team communicate their ideas to each other. And I've now attended so many events run by the BIM task group. I've attended so many events organised by the RICS, because I'm a chartered surveyor, I apologise, rather than a member of CIAT. But I've attended so many events where the keynote speakers, including David Philp, who's the key government advisor on BIM, will begin almost by, and this comes back to a point that Tahar made, it feels like the audience's fears about the software are almost being allayed by the people on the podium kind of saying, don't worry, it's not about the software. If you can't use the software, it doesn't really matter. It's all about collaboration. And then I kind of detect as the day goes on that there are kind of dual areas of panic start to emerge in the audience. One part, which Tahar also alluded to, is that a lot of people in large audiences, open meetings about BIM, large numbers of people in the audience will not in fact know how to use the software. And they're realizing that they're going to have to go through some kind of training process, but they don't really understand training in what. But the other part of that, we'll allay your fears by saying, don't worry, it's not about the software. All we're asking you to do is to make sure that the architect and the engineer and the technologist and the surveyor and the planner and the client and all the various types of subdiscipline will simply come together at every stage of the design process. And if you do that, it'll all be okay. So what I detect is that you then get an audience feeling kind of panicked on a metaphysical level as well as at a kind of physical and practical level. So we felt it would be interesting to undertake research looking specifically at collaborative design practice, within which our view of the way in which we were engaging with BIM here was not so much to look at whether it was Graphisoft or Autodesk software and so on. Our focus was very much on, we know in the next few years that the chances are most members of the team are going to have to collaborate using some form of ICT. So could we maybe try to understand how the ICT in itself could be used as a way to foster collaboration, as opposed to just hoping that this will happen by sharing information that emerges from, COBie data drops and shared models and so on. Now, traditional conceptual design would normally be undertaken using methods that are maybe best illustrated in the kind of slides that you can see on the screen, where you would get some members of the team, some members of the wider design team would come together and start doing these kinds of things, sketching and drawing pictures of what the building might look like. Now, my experience of working as a quantity surveyor, admittedly not within any of the very large quantity surveying practices, but certainly within kind of small and medium level practices, is that the quantity surveyor and most of the disciplines outside of what would traditionally have been regarded as the design disciplines wouldn't typically get very close to this sort of photograph. My impression working as a surveyor was that my role and the role of the engineer to a great extent, and the role of the client, and the role of some of the technology partners, was that we would wait for other people to go through this kind of process. And then the role of the quantity surveyor was then typically to tell you which bits were too expensive. And we would begin with quite an interesting design and end up with something that was much less exciting. So we had kind of concerns here, I suppose, that maybe the design team, as we now try to understand it within BIM discussions, is not actually operating in a traditional sense as a team at that conceptual stage. We're maybe talking to each other, but not in a kind of integrated, collaborative way, maybe. So certainly many years ago, back to the 1990s, certainly there were efforts being made to try to develop ways in which you could try to translate this kind of approach, where you're drawing anyway, into a computer-based environment. And I think there are increasingly valuable reasons for doing that. One concern that I have is that I hope the way that I spoke about this wasn't at all dismissive, because I actually feel that the information that is developed at this kind of a stage by the architect and by the architectural technologist will quite often embody what is actually most important about the design. It's maybe at this stage that you get your kind of core ideas about what you want the building to achieve, how you want it to operate once we get on to the more technically developed parts of the design. And so what we felt was quite exciting about some of these developments is that we perhaps avoid that kind of break in the process where you do your most creative design work using sketches, and then you say, well, yes, now what we'll do is we'll translate what we can of those sketches into models within Revit or ArchiCAD and so on, and then we'll put the sketches into a folder that we may or may not refer to later on. So we felt it was quite exciting that there are maybe developing ways where that kind of sketch-based part of the process becomes a core part of the process right up until the end, so that we could always refer back to those early sketches in much the same way as a product designer would, for example. One thing that we were also aware of is that members of a team, and what we were aware of from our work with public engagement, was that quite often we would be involved in projects where we all appeared to be using the English language, but we were perhaps not using words in the same way, or using words in a way that they always meant the same. And this can obviously translate into visual communication as well, where what is meant by one member of the team and what may be blindingly obvious to one member of the team can lead to kind of serious problems further down the line. The building that my colleagues and I have just moved into, RGU has just built a very large campus on the edge of Aberdeen. And certainly the first part, phase one of the new campus development, included lab facilities that were constructed for our colleagues within the School of Engineering, where although an integrated BIM or a supposedly integrated BIM model was being used, there were clearly a number of different BIM models actually being used, to the point that the subcontractors who were putting in the water supply pipes into a laboratory appeared to be using a different BIM model to the people who were putting in the sinks, to the point that literally you would have water pipes coming up one side of the room and the sinks would be at the other side of the room, and it didn't seem to occur to anybody that maybe the pipes and the sinks should connect with each other, you know? So although this seems like a joke that we're seeing on the screen here, what we're seeing on the screen here didn't happen at RGU, but things like that have the potential to happen all the time on construction sites if we're not actually talking to each other and not collaborating properly. So what I'll do now is I'll just quickly run through a series of studies that we undertook which used one particular IT-based interface. So we used a thing called a surface table, which is manufactured. The one that we've got is manufactured by Samsung. It's now called Pixel Sense. Microsoft used to call it a Surface table, but Surface is now what Microsoft call their version of the iPad. Okay, so they changed the name to Pixel Sense. So it looks like a massive iPad, basically. So at the bottom left-hand side of the screen there, you can see kind of what the interface looked like. So we ran through a number of iterations. So part of the research was trying to develop an interface that people seem to be able to use. But the research behind it, which we've published elsewhere, was actually trying to track how were people interacting with each other and at what stages were the different disciplines actually beginning to participate in the process. So very early stages of the process involved, now hopefully this won't work, yes, involved trying to use normal industry standard software that was kind of provided with the table and so on. So I'll show you just a video here. You can see that we were using versions of normal Microsoft sketching software. There were serious problems with the software in the sense that, I don't know if you can see, you could only use one finger at one time. Only one person could touch the screen at one time. So if, as we can see here, we had 5 people standing around the table, all of whom were quite excited actually about the technology, and all of whom actually wanted to interact, there was a problem that only one person could do that at one time, and if they forgot that they could only use one finger and it had to be vertical, then things started to fall apart. And what we found as the day went on was that the members of the team, because this was a multidisciplinary team, the members of the team who were not used to having to do things like draw and sketch were starting to back away from the process, and we're starting to say, well, you know, you're the architectural technologist, I'll let you do all the drawing because you're used to doing that kind of a thing. So we developed the technology quite significantly in terms of the interface. And to come back to the point that Tahar was making about, we quite often notice when we hold our BIM clinics that the most prominent members of the team are often our own student graduates who have been through not just an educational process, but they've been through a lifetime where the notion of computers being a new thing is simply something that they don't recognize. I'm old enough, I would say, to remember when computers seemed quite novel and we didn't all have one in our homes. But for most of our students coming into university now, that seems like a slightly, it's a difficult situation to actually imagine. Now, so the reason I've selected this particular video, and the reason that it's speeded up, I should say as well, before I started running, was that there certainly seemed to be no distinction among the participants between the fact that they're using a computer sometimes and they're using pens and paper some of the rest of the time. At no point did we say to them that they could or could not do certain things, but it didn't occur to anybody in the group that they should be treating the computer as if it was expensive, or that they should be treating the computer as if up until 5 minutes ago we were using pens and paper and now we're going to use a computer and we're going to do something else. So overlaying the computer with tracing paper and starting to draw on the top and starting to revise sketches as they go through seemed to be quite naturalistic. We also found that all members of the team were actually starting to collaborate much more effectively as well. So as we kind of went through the different versions of the tool itself, we found basically blue is good. These are all positively worded statements. So if you get something in the dark or the light blue, things seem to be all right. I mean, kind of early on in the development of these software interfaces, we did have problems to do with the, whether it was easy to draw and so on. So we developed new versions of the tool where we were gradually able to help people to use the technology in a way that they found to actually be quite intuitive. What I think is important, though, from what I was wanting you to take from the talk this morning, maybe relates back to the earliest points that I made, though, which is that our intention here was to try to make sure that, at the moment when we're using computer modeling software like BIM or any of the other kind of 3D modeling techniques that we might use, these tend to be based still around a screen where you've got a mouse. You may have a certain amount of touchscreen technology, but what we're seeing here is likely to appear on building sites. Certainly all large building sites are likely to see this kind of technology appearing on site in the next couple of years. So really what I'm demonstrating here is a desire from us to make sure that we're actually integrating this within the design process. And we'll continue refining these technologies and these techniques in the next couple of years. But I think what we felt most pleased about with this research is that we were actually able to much better understand what may in fact enhance that collaborative process, and were there perhaps things that could stand in the way of that collaborative process being as positive as it might be. Okay?
Thank you, Richard.
Okay.